Okie dokie. All right. Well, I see folks coming in to the Moses and Singer um, portion of the day. I think a really, really great opportunity for those of you folks who, especially founders and startups who want some information about some of the pitfalls and some of the things you should be looking for when setting up your own companies and trying to advance onto those next stages of maturity and stuff. Today we have our partners Moses and Singer, who actually presented the last summit as well. This time presenting a discussion on the tactics to reduce bias in healthcare AI. Unfortunately, Lisa is not feeling well today. So it will just be Linda Malek, partner of Moses and Singer, and Jason Johnson, who is also a partner. So I will bring them on right now. Hopefully you've all come with a lot of questions for both Linda and Jason, but they're basically going to hold a conversation and discussion around the topic here to hopefully enlighten you in terms of what to look out for when it comes to reducing that bias in your own organizations. So I'm just going to bring them both in. I need to move them from the backstage. Hopefully everybody is having a good session or good bunch of sessions at the summit, and this is just an extra one added on for everybody's day. So now Linda and Jason are here. I will turn the virtual podium over to you, Jason, who I believe is leading the discussion today.
Thank you, Jerry. So my name is Jason Johnson. I'm a partner at Moses and Singer in the healthcare, data privacy, cybersecurity, and intellectual property groups. With me here is Linda Malek, who's actually the chair of the healthcare and data privacy and cybersecurity groups at Moses and Singer. And so on behalf of us, we're both very honored to be able to sponsor the Innovators Summit today. Today's been so far very good set of discussions and presentations. They really kind of go to the heart of the issues that are hitting healthcare in general, and AI in healthcare. And I think what we've learned through a lot of the presentations is that, particularly with everything going on in the last couple of weeks, that this is a very evolving space very rapidly at the moment. And so, I think particularly when you look at AI, there is a lot more specific regulation and guidance that's coming out from both federal and the state level. But whenever you're building your AI platform, it's always been the case where you needed to make sure that you had the right data sets and the right data elements to make sure that you could provide the right type of outcome. And as more and more AI programs have evolved over the last several years, there's been a lot more research and sort of retrospective reviews into some of the data sets and how those data sets are built, and and in bias in particular, how did bias get built into these data sets? And so because, as we all know, there's some disparity issues in healthcare that needs to be addressed, both at the individual level when you're seeing your physician, but also at the level when you're going to use and implement digital apps and other AI-driven products. And so, it's important to take a step back, both at the beginning and as you develop your AI, to make sure that you are addressing these bias issues. And as I mentioned before, this is now becoming more the requirement under the FDA and NIH and other regulatory bodies that you need to do this. And so, I think today we're hopefully going to talk through some general thoughts and issues to think about when you're building your data sets to try to avoid bias, or at least think about how perhaps you're building bias into your data set and you're not realizing it. And then, to the extent you are building your data sets, how do you perhaps verify that this information is avoiding the bias that you're trying to avoid? And lastly, I think, again, we're going to get more into the specifics of the legal and regulatory considerations that are really driving a lot of these, thoughts when it comes to bias in the healthcare data sets. So with that being said, I'm gonna kick it off with a few thoughts, and then Linda will jump in whenever whenever she thinks there's something else to add. But obviously, if you guys have questions, please let us know. I think we're happy to sort of chat and talk through this, because I think this is more of a discussion than us just kind of talking to you guys about this. And so we're happy to make this as interactive as possible. Really think about some of the issues that come into this. But I think first and foremost, when you talk about building your data sets and avoiding bias, I mean, it's really what we're talking about is the training. Like, how are you training the program to provide the outcome that you want, right? And bias in AI can show up in many different ways, right? So it can be related to things like gender and race and ethnicity, but it could also be related to the actual outcome or output that you're looking to eventually have as part of that. So, for example, if you have an app that's supposed to read oxygen saturation, right, used through a pulse ox. Well, if your entire data set is based upon 100 people who are white, then your data set is going to and if it is going to be based upon just people with that skin color, right? And pigmentation is known in the industry to be able to affect the output of a pulse oximeter rating itself, right? And so from the beginning you may not realize it, but that it's those types of issues that can creep into when you're trying to build your data set. The same as when you're trying to come up with perhaps subjective ways to identify an outcome or a data set. I mean, a basic example, which is not in healthcare, right, is that if you have an app that is you want to pick out pretty flowers, right? And so what is a pretty flower, in that case? And so, it's important to really think about up front, what data elements are you using and how are you going to gather those data elements, and using information that's available in the literature to really understand it and create, a real robust, data architecture. So you're really aware of the various types of folks that are going to be affected by what you're trying to address, as well as are you collecting data in a way, in a manner that allows you to make sure that you're actually avoiding bias that is in the data set. And this can also, again, coming back to the idea of the first 100 patients that you train are white in the pulse oximeter arena. That, even let's say then the next 100 you have is folks with Black or Hispanic, right? So darker skin. Even with the way that you've now centered and trained the data, meaning you do 100 of the white and then 100 of the non-white, it's been shown in the research that actually itself can lead to bias, right? Because the initial training, everything builds on the initial training, right? So it's not just that I've got the same number of different skin colors across the spectrum. It's how you've actually ordered it, and the way that you ordered the training can actually lead to certain bias in certain instances. And so, like I said, there's a lot more literature that's out there on this that really discusses that. There's the thought process that goes into the training itself. It's not just I have enough data to cover all the different type of people, but like, how are you actually using the data to train the AI, and is that order also creating bias in your AI program? So again, speaking of sort of the pulse oximeter example, that potentially leads to issues of the diversity of the data set, right? And again, I think, Linda, maybe you can speak a little bit about on the regulatory side, how diversity in data sets is not only a way to reduce bias, but it's actually becoming a requirement as part of submissions.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. So there are a few things that I think we need to think about here, building on what Jason is talking about with respect to the data that you're putting into your data sets and the diversity of it, which then goes to the reliability of it. And um, interestingly, the technology, as we would expect, is kind of outpacing regulation in this area, but we've seen a lot of activity in the last, say, 6 months to a year with respect to various regulatory agencies putting out guidance. And the guidance ranges and the agencies that are putting out guidance are a wide range as well. For example, the Office of Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees really the entire healthcare program, put in its work plan, which is kind of an indication of what it is that the Office of Inspector General, which is the enforcement arm of HHS, is going to focus on in the coming year. And one of the things that they talked about in their work plan for this year is the issue of diversity in clinical research. And so there are a couple of reasons why that's important. One is that although it is important because it's the right thing to do to make sure that you have adequate diversity in a clinical study among research participants, it's now going to be something that's looked at and scrutinized by the Office of Inspector General to ensure that, in fact, that is the case. Now, secondly, the reliability of your data, to the extent that you're pulling data from clinical research studies, will also be affected, as Jason said, with respect to how diverse the participant population is. And this is something that the FDA actually has opined on recently as well. So the FDA in the past year has put out guidance in conjunction with Health Canada and with the UK's health regulatory agency on good machine learning practices. And they have 10 different things that they have issued as guidance for entities that are trying to develop medical devices to follow in terms of what they should be doing with respect to machine learning. And one of the items in that list of 10 is to, in order to eliminate bias or to minimize bias, ensure that both the clinical trial participants as well as the data that is put into an AI algorithm are diverse and representative of the patient population. So those are some of the things that are happening, and we can get into that a little bit further in terms of some of the other agencies that are regulating in this context. I'm going to pause here because we have a question in the chat, and this is a question for you, Jason. Do you see this?
Yeah. So the question is, AI will not replace physicians, but physicians who use AI will replace those who don't. And the question is why? And so, I mean, I think there's probably a couple of reasons, right? So first and foremost, as more AI systems and healthcare apps are developed, it's really going to assist with clinical decision making, right? And so, and as we've seen recently with the one with Page AI that was just approved for for FDA purposes, there's a limit of accuracy in certain types of diagnoses and treatments that you can probably are going to be better under the AI than just a physician review and lab tests, right? And so eventually the patients are going to demand more accurate, better treatments. And physicians who use AI are likely going, versus those who don't, are likely going to be able to offer those. So I think that's number one. I think the second is that with the sort of the advent of all of these monitoring apps in the healthcare space, right? They help physicians actually monitor both patient behavior and patient symptoms. Again, you know, as it stands right now, I go see my doctor once a year for, you know, physical, and then, you know, nothing happens for the next year, right? And so maybe if I'm feeling bad, I'll go to my physician. So there's no real flow of information between me and my physician in that year. And, you know, something could develop during that year that I'm not aware of, and neither is the physician, right? Because I'm not communicating any type of information back and forth. But with AI and with all of the, you know, the health monitoring apps that exist out there, again, physicians who use that, they're going to have access to information, right, in real time in some instances, and really those apps are going to then provide notification to physicians in certain instances that, you know, the typical physician wouldn't get. So now you're starting treatment earlier. And again, I think this is from a patient benefit perspective. This is what you're going to see. You know, the patients are going to tend to go toward the physicians that can, you know, identify issues quicker. And because that always, well, not always, but it typically leads to better health outcomes. And earlier treatments, which also typically lead to better health outcomes. So I think, to me, that's probably two of the reasons off the top of my head why I think that physicians who use AI are probably going to be in the majority in the not so distant future. And we do have another question, Linda.
Yeah.
And I think this goes to you. Yeah.
So the question here is, do you see the regulators making requirements for healthcare AI in the development/validation stage? How will the regulator define adequate diversity, which will be a moving target based on many factors such as therapeutics area, region/location, race, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomics, education, SDH, etc. So this is very much evolving still. It's a thoughtful question, because it's true that these factors tend to change, you know, depending on what you're looking at. What I will say, though, is that the FDA has already given us, FDA in its guidance in conjunction with the UK and Canada, they have already given us a little bit of a window into what they would be looking at. I do think that they are looking at what's happening in the development stage, and what they talk about in this context is ensuring that your data collection protocols at the outset are robust in terms of making sure that the characteristics of the intended patient population, like race, ethnicity, age, gender, etc., are large enough and to be adequate in terms of being representative of the patient population for whom, you know, the device may be used. And so I think documentation, a lot of documentation at the outset is going to be important. I think policies and procedures are going to be really important in this context, because at the end of the day, when the regulators ask questions, they're going to want to see what your design protocols are, what your policies are around data collection, what you have looked at and relied upon in terms of the procedures that you set forth at the design stage. So I think those are the types of things that regulators at this stage anyway will be looking at and asking about.
Yeah, just to add to that, you know, the FDA action plan itself kind of talks about this idea of using retrospective versus prospective data, right? And, you know, perhaps, you know, companies, you know, look data acquisition to machine learn. It's hard to get a significant amount of prospective patients in most instances. So you're, you know, at least building a lot of your program based on retrospective, right? And so the FDA action plan talks about this difference between, you know, prospective versus retrospective. And what the FDA looks like it is probably going to lean toward looking for is commitments on the prospective side, right? Because again, you know, AI data sets aren't static. And so an outcome choice that is delivered today may be different than an outcome choice that's delivered even a month from now. And so it's important that from a prospective basis, as individuals and patients are using this, or physicians, that that action plan and that protocol and procedures that Linda talked about, that's what is going to be necessary and important. And, when we talk about bias in general, it's going to be sort of the same ideas, right? Which is, how is your system spitting out outcomes based on the prospective data that is being added? And, are you seeing differences or changes, right? Because in the small molecule context, for example, you can tell, generally speaking, as new adverse events come up, right? Because you've got a lot of patient data and you're seeing, very particular types of, responses to that. I think that's where it's a little bit more difficult in the AI space. And I think that's part of the reason why the FDA has been struggling with this and other regulatory agencies, right? Is that how do you really monitor that progress of the continuous training to make sure that the output doesn't somehow lean into the biased arena, not purposely, but how can you prevent that and monitor that? So yeah, it's going to be part of whatever comes out of the final guidance and regulations on this for sure. But just know that it is there. It is going to be addressed.
And just, to touch on a couple of the other questions and comments that people have been putting in, I think, in terms of tools, I think Jason touched on that with respect to what you're trying to gather prospectively. And I think that, there's some back and forth here in the chat with respect to the patients and the role of the patients. So I do agree that certainly patients should have ownership over their data, should have the ability to see and control their data, but in terms of how the data is actually collected and from whom, that's really kind of what we're looking at with respect to algorithms that are built through artificial intelligence. Certainly the patient is a partner in all of this and should be viewed as such with respect to how data is gathered from individuals. Sort of zooming out though a bit in terms of higher level, because what we're talking about are just huge sets of data in order to have accuracy. Sometimes, data is collected secondarily from other sources through partnerships between, say, pharma and academic medical centers that have already conducted a lot of research and just have large databases that need to be accessed in order to build an algorithm and populate the AI. So in those kinds of contexts, especially where you're collecting secondary data, I think it's going to be very important to vet the study, who the patient population was, and how large your data set needs to be in order to make sure that it is representative of a diverse population.
Yeah, and I think the last panel actually kind of hit on this a little bit when it comes to is the patient itself following the requirements, right? And what data are you collecting from that patient? And I think this is potentially one place where bias can creep in, right? Is patient non-adherence. And again, I think going back to, when you initially build your AI data set, right? If your app is only being used by a certain portion of the population, even though you built diversity into the initial data set, as that data set grows with this sort of mono population, I think there's going to be a requirement upon companies to ensure that the importation of sort of those same data sets from one patient population doesn't accidentally introduce bias, right? Because again, you may have a clinical trial that's designed perfectly, you may meet all the FDA requirements, but in the real world, right? If your app or whatever isn't used by a diverse population, I think that's where you get some potential issues of bias that may creep into that. And so I think it's going to have to be, something that's going to be thoughtful as part of this, right? And monitored. Because ultimately, right, I mean, if you're looking at this from both the patient perspective and from a business perspective, right? From a patient perspective, patient wants to be treated accurately, right? From a business perspective, you have to deliver a product that continues to treat all patients accurately, right? And so it's going to be important in both of those arenas that you at least maintain some sort of mechanism to ensure that, as the data continues to be live and is added to, that you're making sure that you've at least, avoided the potential bias issue, right? Because the worst is that, now you introduce bias into your app, and, patients of a certain population, gender, ethnicity, whatever, start having harm from this, right? And so no one really wants that. But, so for verification purposes, right, when you talk about verification of data sets, I think that's one ongoing verification requirement that's going to be, so it's not just a static requirement. But even at the front end, right, I think from what we've seen in sort of the guidance documents and the discussion documents, I think there's a lot of hopefully flexibility that's going to be built into how you verify data sets, right? Because I think, as everyone is learning, like each app kind of comes with its own, issues and requirements, right? And so there's going to have to be some flexibility within sort of the FDA and the other regulatory authorities to sort of allow, companies to prove that, yes, their data set is appropriate. So, for example, are you able to use actual human review of data versus the AI to prove that, your outcome is the same, right? Are you using actual, longitudinal, like clinical outcomes and review of patient records to confirm and verify that the initial choice was accurate or not, right? So again, I think there's a lot of, what looks to be flexibility that's going to be built into these regulations, but ultimately, right, it's going to be an evaluation. And so, like Linda said, you just need to have policies and procedures in place, and a plan to show, like, when we say we do something, this is what we're doing. And I think speaking of regulations and laws, it's interesting because the FTC last week, or it may have been this week, they sent a letter to Congress talking about sort of the potential issues of AI, not necessarily in the healthcare space, but in the space related to, letting AI make decisions when it comes to big tech, right? Because one of the reasons they brought this up is that, at least from the FTC's view, they see a lot of potential inaccuracy, bias, and discrimination is sort of creeping into these AI programs, right? And Linda, maybe you can talk specifically about what the FTC has said about how it's going to potentially enforce, digital health against digital health apps in the AI space.
Yeah. So a couple additional thoughts in terms of, issues from a regulatory / oversight perspective. With respect to the Federal Trade Commission specifically, like the FDA, they recently, and at around the same time, a number of months ago, put out their own guidance about bias in the context of AI and how to avoid it, and also what their concerns are and what they'll be looking for. And from their perspective, their regulatory authority is really around consumer protection. And so they want to make sure that not only do companies endeavor to be fair in terms of the data that they collect and unbiased, but also that they are very transparent with respect to explaining to consumers what they're doing, what they've collected, how they've collected it, what potential sources of bias there might be, and putting all of that up in a privacy policy. So, that's another thing that is going to have to be examined by health app developers, is, really looking at your privacy policies and having those looked at closely to make sure that they are transparent in terms of explaining what it is that you're doing, what you're intending to accomplish with the algorithm and the data output, and what you're going to do with it, and how you, in layman's terms, arrived at what the technology does. In other words, How did you try to avoid bias, and how are you utilizing the information that you're gathering? The other thing that I do want to touch on too in this context is there's a bit of a tension actually between data privacy and security and preserving privacy and security and having accurate AI in terms of the machine learning tools that you're building, because as we know and as we've been talking about, in order to promote accuracy, you need to have very large data sets. And the more data you gather, the more risk you have with respect to that data being vulnerable to breach. And so another thing I think to think about in this context is, do you really need identifiable data in order to populate your algorithm? And do you have a way to de-identify data? And what are your security mechanisms in terms of all the data that you're housing and all the data that you're running through as you're testing it, as you're monitoring it, as you're developing it? So that tension between, ensuring privacy and ensuring accuracy is something that has to be dealt with as well at the outset in really in the design stage, and then on an ongoing basis as you monitor the data and what you're doing with it.
And I think that's probably even more important in the context of the fact that, we've kind of been focused right now on the US, but a lot of folks are probably interested in going international. And so once you step outside of the US, the other issue that you're going to run into is maintaining consistency across all required laws and regulations that you're going to run into, particularly if you want to operate in Europe. I think we all know that Europe has been leading the way when it comes to data privacy, particularly for individuals maintaining a significant amount of data privacy for their personal data in Europe. And the European Commission has, identified in proposals already how it wants to regulate AI. And I think the question that you raised, Linda, is going to be an important one, which is, what data do you want to build? To use to build your data set, and thinking about sort of the future and where your business is going to go is going to become even more important, because if you want to build a data set that's based on identifiable data, the question is going to be, can you get data from Europe if you want to move into Europe to have that program work in that way? And then how do you make sure that you've structured your arrangements appropriately to allow you to do that? And so even in Canada, and maybe you can talk to some of the Health Canada UK stuff, Linda, but how the FDA has put an action plan. Even here in North America and Canada and over in the UK, the same issues are going to come up, which is, if you're going to go international, you're going to have to look at, all these different laws and regulations.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Jason, because as stringent as the U.S. laws are, and as attentive as the regulatory agencies in the U.S. are with respect to this, it's true. I think that the EU, Canada, the UK are already further along on this. And so certainly from a data privacy standpoint, to the extent that you're gathering sensitive health data and it's identifiable in any way, or genetic data, which by definition in many jurisdictions is identifiable, there are going to be a lot of considerations with respect to how you protect that data. So again, looking at the bias issue is going to be paramount, but looking at how you secure that data that you're gathering in such large data sets will be paramount, as well as looking at the extent to which you really need identifiable data or not.
Yeah, and I think we are seeing momentum, at least at the federal level, where the U.S. seems to be wanting to catch up with the rest of the world when it comes to data privacy, right? So we've had two bills introduced recently that are meant to address both privacy in general, as well as AI privacy. So we have the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, right? Which is still currently in committee. And we also have, which is bipartisan. We also have another bipartisan bill, which is the Algorithmic Accountability Act of 2022. And so, a lot of what we've talked about today, at least initially, is being built into these bills. So, for example, in the Algorithmic Accountability Act, right, you have to conduct impact assessments for bias and effectiveness. Again, sort of similar to when we were talking about sort of the regulators and the regulatory requirements. And so, there are so there's a lot there's a lot moving in this direction when it comes to addressing bias and the clinical outcomes as part of this. And it may be that we're in a current environment where the U.S. is actually going to get its act together and be able to pass some form of these bills that are going to have actual requirements on entities to maintain data in a particular way. And I think when you get into healthcare, it's always sort of the push and the pull between who am I regulated by, right? And I think that's always sort of an important first question to ask for most of these companies is that, is it the FDA or if it's not the FDA? If it's not the FDA, then what else am I going to be subject to? Because it's really those requirements that's going to drive how you go about trying to, address the issues of bias in your data set, as well as, addressing issues of, am I showing sufficient effectiveness and am I monitoring that effectiveness going forward? But I don't know if you have any thoughts on those bills or what direction you think things are going, but I think certainly, at least at this point in time, there's a lot of activity sort of around AI in general and particularly in the healthcare space.
Yeah, what I was going to say with respect to that is, the point that you brought up with respect to impact assessment, I think is important because even though all the regulation that we're talking about in this space in the US right now is in the form of, guidance, indications on the part of regulators and regulatory oversight agencies in terms of what they're thinking, sort of how things are evolving, and even in the context of this proposed legislation, it's sort of a window in terms of how Congress is viewing this issue. Europe, as we said, is further along on this. But the impact assessment issue, I think, is one that sort of points to the importance of best practices and employing best practices now, because I do think that that's where things are heading. Requiring an impact assessment is really about forward thinking, planning prospectively, trying to figure out in the design stage how your AI is going to have an effect on the population that you're intending it to be used for. And so, rule of thumb here, I think, across the board is take all these things that we've been talking with you about and think about employing them as a best practice for your organization, thinking ahead to what will end up being regulation in all likelihood. There will be evolution here, certainly, but you don't want to be in a position where you haven't taken any of this into account. You're going to get approval and you have to, backtrack and undo. So I think what's important here is to just look at all of this and use it as a roadmap to best practices.
Yeah, and I think the one thing we haven't really addressed specifically, but we've mentioned this, is that a lot of the data that's going to be obtained to train your models is going to be third-party data, right? So you're going to be either in licensing or purchasing data from another entity, and so having these plans and procedures in place before you start building other data sets into your AI, I think is even more important, right? Because you're going to want to evaluate those data sets to make sure that they have the data elements that you want, but also that the data set itself isn't completely biased already, right? How is that built? Where is the data coming from? And so it's important that as part of the due diligence that you're doing, when you're either in licensing data or trying to bring in more data from other places, that you have this vetting process in place to make sure that the data that you're building your data set off is not biased or leading to incorrect outcomes. And that's a difficult one, right? Because I mean, even though data exists everywhere, I think good data sets don't exist everywhere. And this is something that I think a lot of folks struggle with um, when you talk about the structured versus unstructured data and what you're sort of willing to accept and obtain from third-party entities to use to train your algorithm. But just know that at the end of the day, whatever data is in your ultimate data set, it's going to be your responsibility to have to prove to whomever you're going to need to prove it to that it actually meets the standards and requirements. And if you're looking for FDA approval, that's going to be things like bias and effectiveness, right? And so these all become really important questions up front, which leads to questions around who your strategic partners are going to be, who do you want to work with. And so I think quite often it's very tempting just to try to get as much data as you can, particularly if you're looking for proof of concepts and things like that. But again, ultimately, every data set that you bring in is going to be held to the same standard that the data that you create from your own work. So it's important to remember that as part of your in-licensing part. So with that, I know we're coming up on 4:30. I don't know if we have any more questions.
I don't see any additional questions, but one thing I just wanted to say in closing is feel free to reach out to Jason and me through LinkedIn. Our LinkedIn information has been put into the chat. And also, one thing that we didn't mention at the outset is that in addition to being a law firm, we also recently launched a consulting firm to help emerging companies with these issues that we have talked about, as well as other issues that arise in the health tech and life sciences context. So we would be happy to help, in any way that you need, and feel free to reach out to us.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Jason. This is really, I feel like this is invaluable, free consulting, effectively for all these folks on the line. Yeah, I mean, like, we're getting some thank yous in the chats, with the invaluable information that you shared. I think that's one of the main commodities, I think, for folks in the startup space, is the information. So it really is, it is really a godsend that you're able to share that knowledge with the folks here today. If you are open to it, Linda and Jason, the general networking room is open. So if you want to continue the conversation with any of the folks, there and see if anybody wants to continue the conversation or even chat with you offline over there. Thank you both for coming on. Do check the Moses and Slinger booth expo tab as well. There's some information there that about themselves and different so thank you both again, and everybody else, have a great rest of the day, and I will see you on the next panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.